to Europe, where the latest NATO meeting took place. NATO leaders concluded a two-day summit in Ankara, Turkey, with defense spending, Ukraine and Middle East tensions topping the agenda. The alliance pledged 70 billion euros, that's about $80 billion in military aid for Ukraine, and agreed to further strengthen its defense capabilities. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte described the outcome as a major step in transforming the alliance, while US President Donald Trump praised what he called the summit's tremendous unity. The meeting was also overshadowed by renewed tensions with Iran. President Trump declared Washington's memorandum of understanding with Tehran over, following recent attacks linked to the Strait of Hormuz. NATO reaffirmed that Iran must not be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon and called for freedom of navigation in the vital waterway. President Trump also met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, announcing that the United States would allow Ukraine to produce Patriot missile systems under license. The summit ended with NATO reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine while pledging closer defense cooperation among member states. We're joined now by lecturer, business and public analyst, Kenneth Ikenwa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So a lot of things were on the agenda, but what really topped it was, of course, cooperation, defense spending. There was Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia war. There was the US-Iran war as well on the agenda. What do you make of this meeting that just ended in Turkey, NATO summit that just ended in Turkey?
All right, the NATO summit is an eye-opener, not just for member countries, but for all continents. It goes to show that the security of the world is now becoming an asset, and countries are beginning to treat security as an asset, not a liability. And for NATO and NATO-centered organizations, they now realize that security is a very important, aspect of trade infrastructure, trade architecture, and the paradigm is beginning to shift, away from militarization to economic stability, and away from globalization to securitization. So the meeting, for better one of expression, I think technically was aimed at how we could start looking at restructuring the global economy around security. And a lot of that has come the result of the fallout from the Iranian-American war that showed that military might doesn't just solve the problem, but military might can actually compound the problem, especially for Western nations, for core nations that have to secure their supply chain lines more than lay emphasis on just having supply chains that are cheap. So it's a major paradigm shift, and I think countries of the global south, countries in Africa, for instance, Nigeria to be specific, should start looking and start being future ready to see what could be appropriated from the outcomes of this, especially considering the fact that most of the donor nations, most of the nations from which aid actually come from, will now have to escalate the budget expenditure from 2% to 5% of the GDP to plan for security and the new dimensions that bolster the security of nations, talking about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, defense technology, satellite capabilities, and indigenous innovation. So this means that there will be a fall in the disbursement of funds to recipient nations, and it's a good and a bad paradox. A good side of it means that countries like Nigeria, for instance, will have to start thinking organically and start looking inwards on how we can solve our problems and how we can
isn't that what the US president is sort of pushing for? He's been talking about countries, especially within NATO, also pushing up their defense spending. And so if it then has that ripple effect on other countries, I'm sure that it will please Trump. But I wanted to sort of talk about where the alliance stands at the moment. The Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said that the summit had laid the foundations for a stronger alliance. But when President Trump was talking, he had a different, when he was addressing the press, he had a different take. So what is the possibility that the alliance can now move past that series of, crises that have threatened to tear it apart?
All right, the alliance over the last 50 years or still about 70 years created a lot of alignment, within member countries. But member countries are now beginning to seek realignment outside, the NATO architecture itself with other countries. Turkey that you mentioned, for instance, has sought the membership of the BRICS nations because it's beginning to realize that the efficiency of their economy and the effectiveness of their strategic planning will not depend only on, having relationships with member countries of NATO or with countries that are, countries that you will call countries in advanced economies or in global north, but looking downwards, looking to the south to look for these alignments where they can have sustainability in their supply chain systems and where they can have relationships where they can also build trade relations for their own goods and for other goods and services coming in from other aspects, other areas of the world where we're beginning to witness the surge in reverse innovation. But coming back to what Trump has said, and coming back to the fact that expenditure now, budget-wise and GDP-wise, is being emphasized to go up to about 5%, and some nations may want to step it up. I think the real issue is that when meetings like this, come up, and considering the trajectory of the global economy now, and looking at what is happening with diverse wars here and there, the major issue that comes up is how do we commoditize security? How do we assetize security? How do we amortize security to ensure that our own economies do not suffer? You will see that when there are distortions in some of the supply chain lines with respect to its reliability and security, it affects a lot of countries. And that's why you see that the Iran-American war led to even inflation of prices of goods, even in Nigeria. Talking about the PMS, the petrol we buy, and other related, things that had to come through the Strait of Hormuz. All of these have multiple or multiplier global effects. So it's more of nations trying to realign now away from the West to other corridors across the globe and to seeing that they are able to sustain their supply chains and make it more reliable and, de-emphasizes the emphasis on cost of this supply chains, as it were.
I would say that transition as well in Europe. Europe has always depended on the US for security, China for its markets, and Russia for its energy. But we see that, right now they're trying to reorganize and make that transition. But what I also wanted to ask you about is that NATO is now also considering moving away from annual summits. Do you sort of get the sense that this is in part because instead of doing actual work, these summits, whether it's G7, G20 or NATO, are now more focused on the political management of the US president?
Well, NATO has received a very, very huge punch in the second Trump presidency. And we could see how that had ripple effects all over the world. A couple of nations, having their tariffs increased, decreased, overturned here and there at the will and the whims and caprices of the president. But the most important thing that we need to take out of this recent NATO summit is that the realization of NATO countries and the recipient countries that there now is the need for us to have a melting pot of defense, of economics, of trade for the purpose of national development. There is the need for nations to start emphasizing the investment in their security. And for me, taking it away from the global argument, from the global picture, I would like to see how this actually plays out within African countries, especially the sub-Saharan African countries, and particularly Nigeria, that over the last 2-3 decades has not been able to realize its potential as the largest economy in Africa. So it is a question now that borders on how prepared African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, Nigeria in perspective, is really ready for what we can now refer to as persistent strategic competition, and how do we begin to reorganize our resources and our planning infrastructure and architecture so that we can begin to see the need to invest in things like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, defense technology, our satellite capabilities, our indigenous, manufacturing capabilities, so that we can actually be future ready. What NATO is actually signaling to the world is that there is a paradigm shift. It's no longer military might. It is now how we can promote economic stability so that all the nations of the world can benefit from stability instead of, nations of the world being terrorized by the superpower military might of some nations against those that hitherto have been considered inferior nations in terms of military might and in terms of military technology. That is the learning point for Africa, and that should be the learning curve going forward for Nigeria.
Absolutely. Every country will want a strong ally and not a dependent ally. And so Africa probably should take a cue from that. Thank you so much for your time. Kenneth Ikewa, lecturer, business and public policy analyst. A pleasure to have you on.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
Finally, onward now, Russia has reaffirmed its military support for the junta-led governments of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger as the three Sahel nations deepen ties with Moscow. The commitment came during a high-level meeting in Niger's capital, Niamey, where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with his counterpart from the Alliance of Sahel States, known as the AES. In a joint statement, Russia pledged to continue strengthening its operational capacity of the three countries' armed forces as they battle armed groups across the region. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have all been ruled by military governments since a series of coups between 2020 and 2023. All right, that's What Now. Thank you so much for watching. I am Precious Amayu.